Growing up, my wealthy parents consistently made me feel like I was falling short, so it was a shock when they sent my son a package worth $50,000, along with a note that read, "We're flying out soon to see you, my boy." As the title suggests, I'm a 27-year-old woman who has always had a strained relationship with my parents. Growing up with them was far from easy. Both of my parents were overachievers, fiercely competing to be the best in high school and ultimately attending the same university. Without any familiar faces around, they gravitated towards each other, and their bond deepened over the months, leading to a relationship that resulted in my birth. They are undeniably talented and brilliant individuals, both holding high-paying jobs that have afforded us a comfortable life. Yet, their one notable failure was in their role as parents to me. My arrival was the result of an unexpected pregnancy. My mother has confided in me on occasion that neither she nor my father ever wanted children. However, after seeing my heartbeat on their first ultrasound, they couldn't bring themselves to give me up. Additionally, their religious parents would have likely disapproved if they had chosen to terminate the pregnancy. And so, 9 months later, I was born. My parents, driven by their competitive nature, had their first major argument about who would stay home to care for me. It was eventually decided that, given my mother's sacrifices during pregnancy and her higher earnings, she would continue working while my father stayed home to look after me until I was old enough for a babysitter. As a child, I was subjected to rigorous testing designed to determine if I was a prodigy. According to my grandparents, my parents restricted my play to blocks and card games, deliberately avoiding activities that might steer me towards a career in the arts. Painting was off limits, and like other children, I wasn't allowed to watch TV. They encouraged me to play the piano, hoping that with enough training, I could master it one day. Every aspect of my life was meticulously controlled. Junk food and chocolate were banned from my diet. I vividly recall going to birthday parties where I was forbidden from eating cake or other treats, as my parents had preemptively informed the hosts of my dietary restrictions. As you might imagine, my childhood was far from pleasant. While other kids enjoyed their carefree years, I felt like a laboratory experiment, constantly monitored and pushed to become a genius. The only moments of joy I remember were the weekends spent with my grandparents. I was fortunate to have both sets of grandparents who spoiled me without regard for my parents' strict rules. I would watch old black and white movies with my grandfather, a pastime I cherished deeply. It's often said that the stricter the parents, the sneakier the child, and that certainly rang true for me. Despite their attempts to control my every move, I developed a rebellious streak, driven by a longing for normalcy and the freedom to make my own choices. As I entered my teenage years, I quickly learned that I could enjoy a taste of freedom as long as I wasn't caught. I started sneaking out to attend parties, experimenting with makeup in the girls' restroom, and taking pottery classes, activities my parents would never have permitted. Of course, I was occasionally caught, and then faced lectures about the importance of focusing on math and science, the career paths they had envisioned for me. One day, while I was at pottery class, a cute guy from my class asked me out. As a geek who wasn't allowed many friends, I was shocked. I never thought I had the traits that other girls my age seemed to have, so being asked out was a huge deal. We had a great time on the date, but when he dropped me off, my parents saw us just as we were about to kiss. Their expressions were anything but friendly. That night, they made it clear how disappointed they were in me, accusing me of wasting time with a boy and insisting I needed to focus on my studies. My mother harshly reminded me of the sacrifices she made during my pregnancy, emphasizing that she hadn't endured all that just to see me act like a schoolgirl. My eyes filled with tears as she spoke. My father then chimed in, declaring that I was too young to be dating and that my only priority at this age should be studying my books. I tried to argue, explaining that everyone in my class was dating and managing good grades and that I could do the same. But my parents were firm. They told me they regretted having me and that their only wish was for me to achieve great things, just like they had. It was infuriating to hear them speak of me as if I were a pet, devoid of any personal life. They sent me to bed without dinner that night, insisting I reflect on my supposed misdeeds. I was so conditioned to obey them that I never fully realized how traumatizing these incidents were. That night, things took a darker turn. I accidentally overheard my parents discussing me in the dining room. Frozen in shock, I heard the true depth of their disdain. They regretted having me, and my dad expressed his wish that they had a son instead of a daughter, someone they could be proud of. My heart sank as I absorbed the full extent of their hatred. I went to bed feeling utterly numb. From that day on, I never defied my parents again. Honestly, during that time, I was desperately trying to regain my parents' favor, clinging to the hope that someday they would love me and be proud of me. But that day never came. They never attended my graduation and forbade me from going to the graduation party, dismissing it as a waste of time and a likely path to pregnancy for girls. When college rolled around, I had secured a spot at a prestigious university in our state with a full scholarship, and they were immensely proud. My dad, who had a degree in the same field, insisted that I spend my months before college networking with his peers and securing an internship to get ahead of my classmates. In retrospect, I see how overly controlling and crazy their expectations were. I wish I had found the courage to stand up to them. At the time, I truly believed they knew what was best for me, and I didn't want to disappoint them. College was a nightmare. Although I initially enjoyed studying biology, I soon realized it was not the path I wanted to follow. No matter how many hours I spent in the library, the subject became increasingly unbearable. By my second year, I was deep in depression, knowing I couldn't confide in my parents and my grades were plummeting. It was during this dark period that I met Gerald, who would later become my husband. Gerald is the most humorous and carefree person I've ever known, and being with him always lifts my spirits. Unlike my parents, Gerald came from a warm and supportive family. His parents were the complete opposite of mine, filled with love, care, and understanding. They welcomed me into their family, providing the warmth and acceptance I had longed for. Looking back, I realized Gerald arrived in my life at just the right moment. He taught me not to take life so seriously and always knew how to make me laugh. When I finally shared my struggles with him, including my relationship with my parents, he was appalled. He was the first person to point out the abuse in my parents' control over my identity and friendships. Spending more time with him felt like waking up from a long slumber, allowing me to see things with clarity for the first time. I began to realize how I had spent my entire life trying to please my parents, doing everything they wanted without ever considering if it truly made me happy. My grades were slipping, and instead of asking about my well-being, my parents decided to lecture me as usual. They expressed their disappointment in my grades and fretted over the possibility of their friends and family discovering my poor performance. I scoffed at their self-centeredness. They had the nerve to be concerned about their image while I was clearly struggling. It was then that I finally stood up to them and told them how much I hated studying biology and how I had been contemplating switching to psychology. They reacted with shock and fury, insisting that I could not waste my life on such a demeaning degree. To them, choosing psychology was synonymous with failure. I told them that I was an adult now and that I was going to pursue something that made me happy, rather than continue studying biology and remain miserable for the rest of my life. We had a massive fight, and things escalated to the point where I had to involve my grandparents. My parents threatened to make my life a living hell and declared that they would never see my face again. My grandparents supported me and firmly told my parents not to pressure me into pursuing something I didn't want. They countered with the threat that if my parents cut me out of their lives, they would do the same. It was a prolonged battle, but in the end, I succeeded in changing my degree. It was incredibly liberating to finally study something I was passionate about. My college life transformed completely. I woke up each morning without anxiety and ate my meals without worrying about the future. I spent my days attending classes or working diligently at the library, and my evenings with Gerald, exploring the city and enjoying life with him. After dating Gerald for 2 years, I felt it was time to introduce him to my parents, especially since his parents already knew about us. When my parents met Gerald, they immediately disapproved, as I had anticipated. They barely spoke to him and were silent throughout dinner. After he left, they bluntly told me to stay away from men like him, criticizing his background and his pursuit of a degree in the arts, which they despised. They even suggested that he was only interested in me for my parents' money and pressured me to break up with him. I found their reasoning utterly ridiculous and absurd. Gerald and I had been together for a long time, and he had never shown any interest in my parents' wealth. The only thing he knew about them was what I had shared about my childhood. He clearly loved me just as much as I loved him, and it was heartbreaking that my parents couldn't see the genuine love between us. My grandparents, however, had a completely different reaction. When they met Gerald for the first time, they were overjoyed and couldn't stop praising how well-mannered and respectful he was. Despite my parents' objections and protests, I married Gerald after we both graduated from college and secured our own jobs. Marrying Gerald has been the best decision of my life. No one has ever cared for me the way he does. When I lived with my parents, I never felt truly at home, as they were always so distant and cold. But after marrying Gerald, we created a home for ourselves in another state, thousands of miles away from my parents, where I feel warmth, comfort, and belonging. A year later, I found out I was pregnant. Given my traumatic childhood where my parents never wanted me, I was initially terrified to tell Gerald, fearing he might react like them. To my shock, Gerald was overjoyed. He hugged me tightly and expressed his excitement about becoming a parent. His reaction was completely different from what I had feared, and it made me feel so much better about starting our family. His joyful response made me reflect on my own upbringing, and I realized I wanted something entirely different for our child, a loving and nurturing environment, free from the oppressive expectations and tests that my parents had imposed on me. During a routine gynecologist appointment, the doctor surprised us with unexpected news. We were having twins. I was stunned as I stared at the ultrasound screen, which showed two tiny heartbeats. I looked at Gerald, and we both shared a mixture of shock and excitement. Twins, it meant double the joy, but also required us to prepare for a larger family than we had anticipated. As the reality set in, Gerald and I began to adjust our plans. We needed to make space for 2 cribs in the nursery and stock up on double the baby clothes and diapers. The thought of raising 2 little ones at the same time was both overwhelming and thrilling. Throughout the pregnancy, we attended prenatal classes, read parenting books together, and even transformed a room in our home into a cozy nursery for our babies. Gerald's excitement and enthusiasm made me increasingly confident that we could handle parenting together. During my pregnancy, my parents surprisingly began to show some interest in our upcoming parenthood, expressing excitement about meeting their grandchildren. My guard was up, and I couldn't help but be skeptical about their sudden change in behavior. When it came time to reveal the genders of our babies, Gerald's parents organized a small celebration with our close family and friends. My parents had flown in to join the celebration and were staying at a nearby hotel. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as everyone gathered to find out the genders of our twins. The moment finally arrived, and Gerald's mother handed us 2 sealed envelopes containing the gender details, as she had coordinated with our doctor beforehand. As we opened the envelopes, the room erupted with excitement. Each envelope held a card, a pink card for our baby daughter and a blue card for our baby son. Our eyes widened in shock and joy as we realized we were having both a son and a daughter. The room filled with joyous cheers as everyone hugged us excitedly. Gerald's parents were beaming with pride, my grandparents were overjoyed, and our friends warmly congratulated us. However, amidst the celebration, I noticed something unsettling. My parents' faces fell, showing clear disappointment. While everyone else was celebrating and congratulating us, my parents remained silent and distant, not coming forward to offer their congratulations. Their lack of enthusiasm was starkly noticeable. After the celebration, the uneasy feeling caused by my parents' strange behavior lingered. I decided to confront them, seeking an explanation for their reaction. We sat down, and I directly asked why they seemed so distant during such a joyous occasion. Their response caught me off guard. They confessed that they were disappointed with the gender reveal. According to them, they had hoped both of my children would be boys. I was stunned by their absurdity and couldn't believe they would express such disappointment over the genders of their own grandchildren. Suddenly, I remembered the conversation I had overheard about how they had always wanted a son. It was then that I realized they hadn't changed much over the years. Whether it was my pregnancy hormones or my maternal instincts kicking in, I was furious that they could think so poorly of my unborn daughter. I started yelling at them to get out immediately. My mother retorted, telling me to behave more ladylike, but I no longer cared about her opinions and almost pushed them out of my house. Gerald rushed to my side, clearly concerned. I told my parents that they had always hated the fact that I was born, so they wouldn't have the pleasure of knowing their grandchildren because I didn't want their sexist attitude to poison the minds of my babies. I slammed the door in their stunned faces. Over the months, my parents tried to backtrack with a half-hearted apology, but I remained resolute in my decision. When their attempts at reconciliation failed, they tried to manipulate me with guilt, insisting that, as grandparents, they needed to be part of our children's lives. I refused to yield. Gerald has been unwavering in his support, and he, too, does not want our children anywhere near my parents. I just gave birth last week, and it has been a surreal experience, to say the least. I think I've never been happier than the moment I held my 2 babies for the first time. Gerald was by my side throughout the birthing process and has been an incredibly understanding partner. His mother has been staying with us to help with the baby since Gerald couldn't get more days off from his office. Yesterday morning, out of nowhere, I received a package in the mail. Inside were extravagant gifts, each with a hefty price tag. Accompanying the gifts was a note that read, "Flying to see you soon, my boy, your grandparents." I stared at the note in confusion, looking around at the extravagant gifts, and suddenly realized they were all meant for my son only. It was clear that, despite our last altercation, my parents were delusional enough to think I would allow them any part in my son's life while ignoring my daughter and me as a mother. Taking a deep breath, I composed a thoughtful but firm message to send them. I made it very clear that their presence in our lives was not welcome anymore and that they would not have the chance to see their grandchildren. I warned them that if they showed up on our doorstep, I would call the police. I knew it would ignite a storm, and it certainly did. My parents responded with a barrage of messages and calls, accusing me of being ungrateful and stubborn. I ignored their calls and left their messages on read. They claimed that I was being controlling by not allowing them to have a relationship with my son, insisting that they had every right as grandparents. I can't allow them to disrespect my daughter like that. Hence, I believe cutting them off is the right decision. I stand by my choice to cut them out of our lives after everything they have put us through. Update 1. Wow, I did not expect so many comments in just a few hours. I'm glad to see that a majority of you agree that what my parents have done is unforgivable. I share that sentiment because I don't want my daughter to grow up witnessing them favor my son over her. I don't want her to face the same trauma or self-esteem issues that I endured from my parents' toxic upbringing. It boggles my mind how my parents, despite their education, can hold such outdated opinions. They made my life a living hell growing up, and if I continue to let them into our lives, they might impose their beliefs on my children. I can't let that happen. Fortunately, Gerald, his parents, and my grandparents have been incredibly supportive during this time. My grandparents are furious about my parents' favoritism towards my son and have made it clear that they support my decision to cut them out of our lives. They've also spoken with my parents, though I'm not sure how that went. Gerald and I have decided that I should send the gifts back to my parents to send a clear message that we don't need anything from them. I agree, and we will be sending back the gifts tomorrow. Update 2. After I sent back the gifts to my parents, they bombarded me with calls and texts, insisting that we needed to meet. This weekend, I asked them to fly out so we could talk face to face. I invited them to lunch at a nearby restaurant. When they arrived, my mother, without even listening to me, launched into a rant about how I had no right to keep them away from their grandchildren. I told them straight up that, as their parent, I had every right to protect my children from anyone I deemed toxic, and if they wanted to cry about it, they could do so to the walls. My dad tried to justify their actions, saying that my mother didn't mean it and that they just wanted to see their grandson. I scoffed and asked why they kept mentioning my son when I had a daughter as well. I reminded them how I had told them I disliked their preference for sons over daughters and that I didn't want that for my daughter. My parents then said I should be more forgiving since they were still learning, and if I wanted them to meet my daughter, they wouldn't mind. Their casual sexism infuriated me, and the conversation quickly turned heated. After this, I made it clear that their biased attitude was unacceptable, especially concerning my children. I explained that I didn't want their negativity around us, and that I didn't want them anywhere near my children for the rest of their lives. My parents started screaming, threatening to take me to court, and I told them they were welcome to do so, as it would give me an opportunity to recount my childhood stories where they had abused me and got away with it. My parents stared at me in horror as I continued, saying that I wouldn't stop there. I would tell our entire family about what they had done to me. Knowing how important their reputation was to them, they were at a loss for words, realizing I wasn't messing around. There were several minutes of heated arguments, but ultimately I told them firmly that I couldn't have them in our lives anymore, and they could complain as much as they wanted, since my decision was never going to change. I walked away that day with the satisfaction that my children would never be traumatized by them the way I was while growing up. It hasn't been an easy decision, but I had to prioritize the well-being of my family. Gerald has been an immense support throughout this. We've blocked them so they have no way to reach out to us. Cutting off my parents permanently is challenging, but I'm holding my ground for the sake of my kids. I appreciate all the support I've received from this community during this tough time. Update 3. Several months have passed since I sent back the gifts and made it clear to my parents that they were no longer welcome in our lives. Thanks to many comments about the possibility of my parents taking legal action, Gerald and I decided to consult with a family lawyer to explore our options. We were reassured that their claim would hold no ground, as I have thousands of text messages documenting the abuse I endured from my parents. We now feel confident that they can't do anything to us. On a positive note, we've been cherishing our time with our twins and creating beautiful memories as a family. My daughter and son are thriving, and we are gradually learning how to manage the challenges of having twins. We visit my grandparents whenever we can or video call them so they can spend time with our children. The support from Gerald's parents has been invaluable. They babysit our children whenever Gerald and I need some time together or when I'm too exhausted. Our little family unit is strong, and we're determined to shield our children from the negativity that affected my own upbringing. I appreciate the ongoing support from everyone. It reinforces my belief that prioritizing the well-being of my children is the most important responsibility I have as a parent.